So that's why Calvinists will say, yeah, no, we make real choices. We really do make a choice. But his choice is what brings about our choice. His choice determines our choice, but it's still our choice. Okay? And we've talked about this before in this broadcast, especially with regard to J.I. Packer, who wrote in his book on sovereignty and evangelism this concept and idea that we have to, as theologians, adopt this concept of an antinomy between the sovereignty of God and the free will of man, or the responsibility of man, which we're going to look at. Because what I think ultimately J.I. Packer argues is for this concept of theological doublethink. And doublethink just means the power of holding two contradictory beliefs in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them. We've talked about this before when we confronted John MacArthur, who ultimately made the same kinds of arguments that the concept of God's sovereignty and human freedom are friends, and they don't need to be reconciled because they're already friends, and just don't try to even reconcile them because they're irreconcilable. They're just they're friends that you've just got to accept as being friends. And so it's not an appeal, in my estimation, an appeal to mystery with regard to Calvinism. It is an appeal to an antinomy, or an apparent contradiction, a seeming contradiction, as we'll see, I think, from this article, really from the book, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God by J.I. Packer, which is a very well-known book. It's quoted quite regularly by Calvinists. It's referred to quite regularly when talking about why do we evangelize if God is sovereign. This is usually the go-to resource for Calvinists to maintain that evangelism is still a necessity and still a part of the Calvinistic worldview, as they'll appeal to J.I. Packer, who is a kind of a lower, more moderate form of Calvinism. And it's interesting to me, which we'll look at, that John Piper, who is younger, obviously, than J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer's gone on to be with the Lord recently, back in July. And J.I. Packer was confronted or rebuked, in a sense, or corrected in a nice way by John Piper in the 1970s through an article, which we're going to go over here. And I think looking at these two side by sides, when you look at these two views side by side, you'll see the antinomy that I'm talking about, the doublethink that I'm talking about. That there's two contradictory ideas. Ultimately, God determines everything, yet men are still responsible for what God determines them to do. That God's responsible for what you're responsible for. It's A equals not A in my mind, at least. And again, maybe my mind has just been determined by God not to be able to accept doublethink, to reject doublethink. But Calvinists apparently have the ability to take in doublethink and live with doublethink. Some people can't live it. I think John Piper is one of those kinds of people who can't live with doublethink. I think J.I. Packer can live with doublethink. And you'll know what I mean once we go through these articles. So bear with me as we go through these, because you'll see the different approaches for these two well-known, well-respected Calvinistic apologists and teachers and pastors and theologians coming at this same exact doctrine with basically the same exact views and beliefs, but one of them adopting doublethink as their ability to deal with it, and the other one rejecting doublethink and ultimately redefining the terms in order to make it work for them. And you'll see what I mean as we go through this. Let's look first at the resource from J.I. Packer, the senior theologian within Calvinism, in his book, Evangelism and Sovereignty. He says this: our aim in the present study is to think out the nature of Christians' evangelistic task in the light of this agreed presupposition that God is sovereign in salvation. Now, let me just remind you what Calvinists mean by sovereign. And I think this is really important for you to understand what we're talking about when we say sovereignty, okay? Because when a Calvinist says sovereignty, he means determinism, i.e. God determines whatsoever comes to pass through meticulous divine control. Through his decree, he determines whatsoever comes to pass. That's what they mean by sovereign. What we mean by sovereign is what it means in every other dictionary. It means God has the right to do what he pleases. But he is pleased to give humans responsibility, the ability to respond either positively or negatively to his truth. They're responsible for those things. Sovereign does not mean to control. Sovereign means the ability to do as one pleases. And therefore, sovereignty is not the correct word to use, even by some Calvinists' own estimation. We've gone through some articles, even from other Calvinist correcting other Calvinists on the word sovereign, that the word that they're looking for is providence. And you should probably say, I believe in meticulous providence, not that you just believe God's sovereign. We all believe in the sovereignty of God. And so he talks about God is sovereign in salvation. He goes on to say, now we need to recognize right at the outset that this is no easy assignment. All theological topics contain pitfalls for the unwary. And I would just push back and say, I don't think it's a very difficult assignment if you don't assume a determinism. If you don't assume that God's sovereignty equals determinism, then this task is really not as difficult as it's made out to be, okay? For God's truth is never quite what man would have expected, and our present subject is more treacherous than most. Again, I don't think it's all that treacherous and that difficult if you just remove the effectuality language of the determinist over the top of scriptures and you simply accept the basics of the simplicity of the gospel, that God loves all people. He sent the message so that all people could respond to that message, and anyone can respond to that message to be saved. It's really, really basic and sensible. It's not treacherous. It's not difficult. It's not a bunch of esoteric baggage. It's difficult to unpack. There's no infralapsarian and superlapsarian and all these weird kinds of theological baggage that I think have been added to the text because of determinism inserting itself in around the 5th century. So this is because in thinking, J.I. Packer going on to write here, this is because in thinking it through, we have to deal with an antinomy. Now, that word right there is going to come up a lot, an antinomy, okay? He's about to define it, but this is what John Piper is going to take issue with. So pay attention to this part, okay? He calls it an antinomy. I call it doublethink, okay? I think it's not, well, you'll see, okay? An antinomy in the biblical revelation. And in such circumstances, our finite fallen minds are more than ordinarily apt to go astray. Now, remember that when you talk about finite fallen minds, we're talking about Christian people here who are having this debate. So we're not talking about people who are just fallen and finite. We're talking about people who've been redeemed and regenerated, who are having this dispute and this disagreement. Even between J.I. Packer and John Calvin, both Calvinist, both regenerate, presumably, obviously, people having a disagreement over how you deal with these issues. And so it's not just fallen, lost sinners who are having a disagreement over philosophical quandaries. This is about people who are presumably chosen by God, loved by God, redeemed by God, regenerated by God, who have now the mind of Christ having these disputes. So keep that in mind as well. What is meant by antinomy? The shorter Oxford English Dictionary defines it as a contradiction between conclusions which seem equally logical, reasonable, or necessary. Now notice that the dictionary he even cites calls it a contradiction, okay? He calls it a contradiction in his own source. Now, he's going to correct that source. In other words, he's not going to agree with that source, but I just want you to point out, words mean things, okay? And thus, when the dictionary calls an antinomy a contradiction, this is one of the reasons John Piper has an issue with J.I. Packer's use of the word antinomy, because it does mean a contradiction based upon the basic meaning of it. It is a contradiction between two conclusions that seem equally logical, equally reasonable and necessary, okay? For our purposes, J.I. Packer writes, for our purposes, I should even say maybe our Calvinistic purpose, okay, this definition is not quite accurate. The opening word should read an appearance of a contradiction. For the whole point of an antinomy in theology, at any rate, is that it's not a real contradiction, though it looks like one. In other words, in theology, we can't have contradictions. And so we're going to call it a seeming contradiction. It is a contradiction, but we're just going to say it seems like a contradiction because in theology, you really can't have a contradiction. In other words, we're going to agree A equals not A, and that is a contradiction, but we're going to just call it a seeming contradiction because in theology, we don't have contradictions. You see the logic within this? Okay, you can see why John Piper doesn't sit well with John Piper, because John Piper, you can say what you will about him, he likes logic, okay? And so he like Jonathan Edwards, who is really his teacher, the people he quotes from, Jonathan Edwards, is too much of a logical mind, a rational mind, to accept this kind of a theological assertion that ultimately we're just going to adopt a contradiction. We're just going to adopt doublethink, okay? And that's what J.I. Packer's ultimately saying we have to do. We just have to adopt doublethink. We have to accept there's a contradiction, an antinomy. And in theology, it's just a seeming contradiction because we can't have a contradiction if it's theological, obviously. And so it is an apparent incompatibility between two apparent truths. An antinomy exists when a pair of principles stand side by side, seemingly irreconcilable, yet both undeniable. So now his assertion is that sovereignty, as he's defined it as determinism, is undeniable. Of course, I would contend with that, right? There are cogent reasons for believing each of them. Each rest on clear and solid evidence, but it is a mystery to how they can be squared with each other. You can see that each must be true on its own, but you do not see how they can both be true together. And then he gives an example of that, but I'm going to skip on down because he gives an example through science and some other things. And then he talks a little bit about paradoxes. And he says an antinomy is not the same as a paradox. And then he explains why an antinomy is not the same as a paradox. And he even says here, and I'll pick up there, it says also it should be noticed that a paradox is always comprehensible. In other words, you can comprehend a paradox. A speaker or a writer casts his ideas into paradoxes in order to make them memorable and to provoke thought about them. But the person at the receiving end must be able, on reflection, to see how to unravel the paradox. Otherwise, it would seem to him to be really self-contradictory and therefore meaningless. An incomprehensible paradox could not be distinguished from a mere contradiction in terms. Sheer paradox would thus have to be written off as sheer nonsense. And then he goes on to say, by contrast, however, an antinomy is neither dispensable nor comprehensible. Do you understand what he's trying to say? He says, I don't want to call this Calvinistic quandary of God being deterministically controlling everything, yet we're responsible for what he controls. I don't want to call that a paradox because that's not really what it is. It is incomprehensible. It is not able to be explained or understood, and nor should it be we shouldn't even try to, he goes on to say. It is not a figure of speech, he says, but an relation between two statements of fact. It is not deliberately manufactured. It is forced on us by the facts themselves. It is unavoidable, and it is insoluble. We do not invent it, and we cannot explain it, nor is there any way to get rid of it, save by falsifying the very facts that lead us to it. Now, I want you to hear that last statement, okay? There's no way to get rid of this contradiction, this paradox, if you will, this antinomy, unless you falsify the very facts that led us to this quandary in the first place. Now, in my estimation, that's what you're about to hear Piper do. Piper is going to falsify one of the two facts. He's going to falsify what human responsibility ultimately looks like. In other words, he's going to redefine free will based upon his teachings from Jonathan Edwards and redefine free will to mean something different than it means in the mind of someone like Packer or other theologians, because free will, for the most part, means the ability to make your own determinations, to do otherwise, to either accept or reject the gospel. And either one of those are real, actual choices that you can make. And I believe that's exactly the kind of mindset that Packer is talking about. He believes that mankind are responsible for saying yes or no to the gospel. They are completely capable, morally speaking, to either say yes or no to the truth of the gospel, but yet they're still responsible, even though God's ultimately the one who chooses their choices. And we just have to deal with that. Now, Piper's going to come along and he's going to insert compatibilism, i.e. people are free as long as they're doing what they want, but their wants are ultimately controlled by the divine. And that's how he's going to get around this contradiction, this paradox. So he's going to redefine human responsibility, i.e. free will, under the compatibilistic framework, which ultimately is saying that people are free insofar as they're doing what they want to do. But what they want to do is ultimately determined by God, but it's still free because they want to do it. And that's how he's going to ultimately falsify the very facts that led us to the very paradox or the antinomy or the contradiction, whatever you want to call it, that Packer, all the P's here, Packer, pickle, picker, peppers. Okay, get them all tangled up in my. Just wait until we get the purposelessness, and we'll get all kinds of fun things flying out of my mouth, I'm sure. Okay, so let's go to Piper's response to Packer. Okay, I should maybe call him John and J.I. I'm not sure which. Okay, so here's a response to Packer on the so-called antinomy between sovereignty of God and human responsibility, and this is an article by John Piper. Okay, everybody following what's happening here. So Piper is writing an article in response to Packer. In his book, Evangelism and the Sovereignty of God, back in 1961, J.I. Packer argues that the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man is an antinomy, okay, as we just read. He defines antinomy as an appearance of a contradiction between conclusions which seem logical, reasonable, and necessary. It is neither dispensable nor comprehensible. It is unavoidable and insoluble. We do not invent it, and we cannot explain it. God, quote, orders and controls all things, human actions among them, yet he holds every man responsible for the choices he makes and the courses of action he pursues. To our finite minds, this is inexplicable. So again, Piper now has just restated the issues he's going to contend with from Packer's article. Everybody following? All right, here we go. This is, in other words, that's all doublethink. In other words, Frank is married, but he's also a bachelor, and that's insoluble. It's just impossible for you to understand it. Don't try to argue with it. It's just true. Frank is married and a bachelor. And it's just, both of them are true. Don't even try to reconcile that. It's just true, okay? And what Piper is going to come along and do is he's going to redefine he's going to redefine one of those two things, a married or a bachelor. He's going to redefine the word bachelor to mean something it's never meant before, to make it not seem like a contradiction anymore. And that's basically what I think Packer is pushing back against. Packer is saying, don't try to redefine the terms, just accept it as a paradox, an antinomy, a contradiction. Just accept it as a seeming contradiction and just live with it. Don't try to fight it. Just live with it. And Piper knows that an apologist can't do that. A good theologian can't just say, contradictions must be true. You can't call Frank a married bachelor. He knows that falsifies his theology. He just like Jonathan Edwards does. So Piper is going to come along and say, no, we can't just call it a contradiction and live with it. We can't just double think. We have to deal with it. So how does he deal with it? He redefines either the word married or the word bachelor. He redefines the word determinism or the concept of determinism, or he redefines the concept of freedom or responsibility, which is what he does. He defines responsibility as something that is completely lacking all responsibility, because there's nothing that even remotely resembles being truly responsible under the claims of the determinism, as far as I can tell, at least. I guess God determined for me to think that. I'm not sure which. Okay. So the first thing to notice here is that the antinomy, as Packer sees it, is not between sovereignty of God and the free will of man. Packer is too good a biblical scholar to think there was any such thing as free will taught in the scriptures. I would contend with that. I think Packer does actually teach free will as we do. This is one of the reasons I think you've got people like Rav Zacharias and other people referring to Packer, because Packer does at least affirm human responsibility, libertarian responsibility, in the same way that we do in the writings that I am familiar with, at least. And so I think Piper is trying to get Packer more on his side by saying this. I don't think that it's probably correct, in my estimation. Thus, the whole conversation between him and myself can proceed on in a cordial agreement that free will is an unbiblical notion that is not part of the antinomy, because it is not part of the revelation. But now I would like to ask where Packer gets the idea that this so-called antinomy between the sovereignty of God and the responsibility of man is inexplicable to our finite minds. Does he simply have an intuitive feeling that we can't understand the unity of these two truths? Or is that he has tried for 40 years to explain it and has found that he can't? Or does he appeal to endless disputes in the church on the subject? Packer does not tell us why he thinks the antinomy is an antinomy. He simply assumes that it, quote, sounds like a contradiction to everybody. He also assumes that anyone who is discontent with an antinomy and tries to probe into the consistency of these two halves is guilty of suspicious speculation. And he references page 24 of Packer's work. Piper says, I disagree with both assumptions. Everybody does not think the sovereignty of God, i.e. determinism, and the responsibility of man, i.e. free will, are apparently contradictory. For example, Jonathan Edwards. Nor is it, in my judgment, improper to probe into the very mind of God if done in the right spirit. So you hear what's happening. Packer appeals to doublethink, i.e. it's an apparent contradiction, just don't even try to explain it as insoluble. It's inexplicable, just accept it. They're two friends that don't need to be reconciled, so don't even try to reconcile them. Piper comes along and goes, no, they can be reconciled. Edwards does a good job of reconciling it. How does he reconcile it? He redefines free will to mean something it doesn't mean. It's a non-free free will, as Ken Wilson puts it. Okay, he redefines free will to ultimately mean something it doesn't mean. Is basically what he does. So here's the proper probing section of the article from Piper. He writes, let's take the second point first. Packer refers to Romans 9:19. You will say to me, why does he find fault? For who resists his will, O man? On the contrary, who are you to dispute with God? What is Paul rebuking here? Now that's a great question. What is Paul rebuking here? Is he rebuking somebody who's rebuking against the claims of Calvinism? I.e., is he rebuking somebody who's ultimately upset at the concept of reprobating people before they're born? The concept of unconditionally electing some people for salvation and some people for reprobation, is that what he's rebuking? Because if he is, Calvinists are right. I'm just going to lay it out there on the table. If that's what Paul is rebuking, then Calvinists are right. And we should all become Calvinist immediately, because that's what the inspired word is teaching. However, if Paul is not rebuking the concept and idea of double predestination, but instead is rebuking the concept and idea of a Jew who is being hardened and calloused in his rebellion, now being cut off in his rebellion so as to accomplish the ingrafting of the Gentile barbarians, then Calvinism doesn't have a leg to stand on. And of course, that would be our contention, as we've gone over in many other episodes, and I won't spend much more time belaboring that on this episode. So he goes on to say, a sincere, humble desire to understand the ways of God. No, he is rebuking the arrogance that calls God's ways into question. The word means to grumble, dispute, make unjustified accusations. Paul's dander is up because he has already explained in 9:14 through 18 why God is righteous in electing some men and rejecting others totally apart from their distinctives. Again, we just disagree, obviously, with Piper's and Packer's interpretation of Romans 9, which I won't belabor on this episode because I've done so much on other episodes, including in my published material on the Potter's Promise, if you want to go in more detail. But the objector, unwilling to accept that answer, calls God into question again. Yet Paul, unwilling that any should say that he has failed to explain the matter, goes on in verse 22 and 23 and unfolds further his justification of the ways of God. If finite men are not to understand how God can be righteous while condemning those he sovereignly controls, then why did Paul write Romans 9:14 through 23? Again, we've given our answer to that. It's the same interlocutor that we see in Romans 3, by the way, which is the Jew who is questioning how is it righteous for God to harden Jews who have become rebellious so as to accomplish his good purpose to bring about his plan of redemption through their rebellion and to save unlawful, dirty, unclean Gentiles who aren't following the laws, who aren't pursuing it through the law of righteousness, but who are believing in this Jesus of Nazareth guy and supposedly being deemed as righteous through faith alone. That's the objector that Paul is addressing in the text, according to our interpretation. And ironically, even some Calvinists have interpreted it not to be double predestination, just so you're aware. Even some Reformed scholars have not gone as far as other Reformed scholars with regard to this. So he goes on to write, I think Packer is wrong when he says, concerning Paul's response in Romans 9, he does not attempt to demonstrate the propriety of God's action. He does indeed. That is why he wrote verse 14 through 23. I also reject the sentiment of these words. The Creator has told us that he is both sovereign Lord and righteous judge, and that should be enough for us, end quote. Why should that be enough for us? If that were enough for us, Paul would have told the questioner at Romans 9:14 to keep his mouth shut. But as a matter of fact, the only time Paul ever tells people to keep their mouth shut is when they're boasting. If our hearts and our minds pant like the hart after the water brook of God's deep mind, it may not be pride, it may be worship. There is not one sentence that I know of in the New Testament which tells us the limits of what we can know about God and his ways. I might just say in response to much silly talk about the dangers of exhausting the mysteries of God, that my conception of God makes such a thought ludicrous if we may compare God's wisdom to a ragged mountain and our growing understanding of its slow ascent. I do not have the slightest fear that during some midnight meditation, I might, by the grace of God, attain some new ridge of all of a sudden find that I am on the peak of the mountain where no more cliffs to climb. On the contrary, for every newly attained height of insight, there stretches out an ever more glorious. I'm trying to get through a little bit. Sorry, I meant to mark out a little bit more here. Fast forwarding. Okay. On the other point of disagreement with Packer was his assumption that the twofold presentation in Scripture of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility sounds to everybody like a contradiction. This is the point I was trying to get to. It didn't sound like one to Jonathan Edwards after he thought about it long enough, and doesn't sound like one to me. I think anyone who is going to dogmatically assert that humans can't understand this antinomy must first show that Jonathan Edwards has not understood it. I will try to develop, in the briefest way I know, Edwards' attempts to show that God's moral government over mankind, his treating them as moral agents, making them the objects of his commands, counsels, calls, warnings, expiations, promises, threatenings, rewards, punishments. It's not all inconsistent with the determining disposal of all the events of every kind throughout the universe in his providence, neither by positive efficiency or permission. Okay? Now, going on. First, Edwards argues that the thing which determines what the will chooses is not the will itself, but rather motives which come from inside the will. Now, what is he unpacking here? He's unpacking compatibilism. So what he's ultimately saying is that it's not the will itself that makes the determination, it's the motive. And the motives are ultimately by divine decree. And so, in other words, to put it another way, people choose in accordance with their nature, their desires. Their will is bound by their nature, their desires. It reduces it, in my estimation, to animal instinct. In other words, in the same way that a vulture eats meat, and a rabbit eats grass or lettuce, it's not a choice, a moral choice of the creature to do that. It is an animal instinctive thing because the desire is preset by the Creator. And the Creator is ultimately determining the motives, and given the circumstances to choose between eating meat or grass, the rabbit is going to choose the grass. He's not going to choose the meat because rabbits are not made to eat meat, right? And so your strongest inclination, your strongest desire is determined by your instinctive created nature. And that's ultimately what I believe compatibilism has reduced all moral choices of humans to be, is that we're ultimately acting in accordance with our greatest desire, our motive, which is determined by our Maker, given the circumstances, which are also equally determined by our Maker. So it's just determinism. It's determinism dressed up with quote unquote secondary causes, so that you can some way seemingly give humanity some sense of responsibility for their actions and choices, because you can say, well, they desired to do it. But you kind of ignore what's happening behind the scenes, that the reason they desire to do it is because God created them with that desire and they could not have done otherwise. And that's just kind of avoided, ignored, or not addressed as a part of the problem within the Calvinistic / compatibilistic claim of the Scriptures. And so ultimately what you've got is J.I. Packer, who's primarily a theologian, versus Edwards, who's primarily a philosopher. And philosophers know well that you can't falsify a view by claiming contradiction upon it. And therefore, philosophers like Jonathan Edwards is more arguing from a philosophical framework of determinism and explaining how determinism can still maintain some sense of human responsibility, i.e. a person is free as long as they're doing what they want. Just ignore the fact that what they want is determined by their Maker. That's what it's coming down to. So more precisely, Piper goes on to write, it is that motive which it stands in the view of the mind is the strongest that determines the will. So it's the motive which stands as in the mind is the strongest that determines the will. So in other words, instead of things just being influential, which is what we would say if you go back and listen to my interview with Eric Hernandez and Tim Stratton. I also talked about this. Braxton Hunter, I've had him on to talk about this, where we talk about how we don't believe in motives or desires being determinative. They're influential, not determinative. Agents are determiners, not motives and not desires. Otherwise, they just become pure instinctive reflexes that we're just acting in accordance with what God has decided we would choose, and he chooses our choices, in other words. So we still make real choices, but those real choices are determined by the choice he makes for us to make. In other words, so that's why Calvinists will say, yeah, no, we make real choices. We really do make a choice. But his choice is what brings about our choice. His choice determines our choice, but it's still our choice. Okay? So you just called it his and you called it ours. You just called it A and you said it's not A. You just called it determinism but said it's free. You've just said it's a married bachelor, and you're now trying to say it's okay to adopt contradictions. And so he goes on to say, he defines motive like this. By motive, I mean the whole of that which moves, excites, or invites the mind to volition, whether that be one thing singly or many things conjunctly. By strongest motive, he meant that which appears to most inviting. Okay, so that which appears to most inviting. In other words, that right there is not just an influence, it's a determinative factor. Like the example I've used before, if I ate a piece of cake yesterday, then you ask me, what was the cause? Why did you eat that piece of cake? And I say, well, because cake tastes so good. Would any of you interpret that to mean, well, then, therefore, the taste of cake causally determined for Leighton to choose to eat cake? No. I causally determined for myself to eat a piece of cake based upon the influence of my desire or for the taste of cake, right? So I have many competing desires from which I am choosing to fulfill. So I may have the desire to diet or to lose weight, or I may have desire for cake and the taste of cake and all these kinds of other competing desires, whether my wife is watching who's holding me accountable, or whether one of my friends is aware of whether I'm going to choose. There's a lot of competing desires there. But who is the determiner? Leighton is. Leighton is the free agent. Okay, he's responsible. The taste of cake does not do anything. It influences. It doesn't determine anything. I determine based upon what I choose to desire. In other words, the reason it's the greatest desire is because I choose to act upon that one. It's not animal instinct where I am just reflexively controlled like some robot or some puppet or some causal agent that's just being caused by conditions beyond my control. And so this is the problem with compatibilistic determinism, which is what Jonathan Edwards was proposing and what John Piper is known to be proposing today and promoting today, which is ultimately God brings about everything, even the desires and choices and actions of evil creatures when they molest and rape and murder and Holocaust, everything, even from Piper's own website says, is all from the hand of God, directly from the hand of God, causally from the hand of God, even decisively. The decisive cause are his exact words for it. So anybody who's under the delusion that that's not what Piper is teaching, then you don't understand Piper. He's contending with Packer, who represents, I think, more of a kind of a mainstream lower form of Calvinism that we're seeing surge within the SBC. And this is one of the reasons you'll get a lot of people who push back against me and say, well, you just don't understand Calvinism, because I'm confronting Piper kind of Calvinism, the Jonathan Edwards kind of Calvinism, the consistent kind of Calvinism, the kind of Calvinism we hear from Chris Date and Big Young and other people who know what they're talking about when it comes to the philosophical issues contained here, versus the lower forms of, mere theologians who haven't really delved into the logical and philosophical arguments behind their theology, who are just pretty much saying these are two antinomies that you just have to accept to be true.